Welcome. Thank you for sticking around on what looks like the sunniest day of Railvolution here in Seattle. My name is Jodie. I work with the Maryland Department of Transportation, leading the P3 program across all modes, but right now we're focusing on transit as one of our next big projects. As this session is titled, it's Transit P3s, Wave of the Future, ? So hopefully we'll be able to answer that question is in this discussion. This session is going to start a little differently. I'm moderating, but I'm also going to present a 101 on P3s and transit and how they apply in general. And then we'll be talking about two projects that are both in process. One in Denver with Bill Van Meter, and then also in Vancouver with John Haythorne, and they will be giving their own presentations. I will introduce them after the 101, which I have here. In general, and I believe in some of the sessions, the term P3 or public-private partnerships has come up, and it's often used to describe a variety of different partnerships or projects that are undertaken jointly with the public sector and the private sector. For the purposes of this discussion and for the presentations and the projects that we'll be discussing, there's a very specific range of projects that tend to fit in to what would be a P3. And this slide shows the types of projects. You'll see there are certain things that are not included, like design build, and some of the types of projects that you might commonly refer to as TOD or joint development. It's really those types of projects that involve long-term agreements with the private sector, where the private sector is delivering or running or maintaining an asset for a period of time that is controlled by the performance of the project, or the performance of the asset. So it's slightly different than maybe some of the other public-private partnerships that might have been discussed in some of the other sessions. That being said, I think it has a lot to do in some of the similar concepts with some of these other relationships that have typically involved the private sector. As I said, there isn't a really strong, well-defined definition for P3s, both broadly and then within that range that I was just showing. But in general, there are certain aspects and characteristics of P3s that are common both to the project that I'm working on currently in Maryland and the projects that you'll be hearing about shortly. And this involves, again, the private entity will perform a variety of functions, either development or construction of an asset, the operations and maintenance of that asset over a long period of time, and often in connection with the performance of that asset, so that the public sector has clear control over how the asset is operated and maintained over the term of the contract. It involves the allocation of risks. This is something that's a key concept for P3s, that the private sector can do things very well, the public sector can do other things very well, and they're allocating the risks between the two in such a way that you're achieving efficiencies through the contract over the period of time. And it's, again, a long period of time. It's not 5, 10 years. It's several decades. A lot of these are 30, 40, 50 years over a period of time where you are really planning for the long-term operations and maintenance of these assets. And that it's important to remember that in most cases, the government retains ownership. You're not selling the asset. It's not privatization. There's the ownership and the responsibility for the project is still solely in the government. It's government's hands, and quite frankly, when people have concerns or express support for the project, is often viewed as it's the government's project. And you have a general set of misconceptions often with the public when you're talking about P3s. You often see in newspapers that you're selling the asset, it's privatization of the asset, that the private sector is going to run off and do this project without any input from the public sector or from the communities or any of the other stakeholders, and that's completely the opposite of what a P3 is typically. It's very, very truly a partnership between the public and private sector in delivering this asset in a way that is responsive to the public sector needs, the community needs, and stakeholder needs, but with the added efficiencies that the private sector can achieve by bundling together both the design and the construction with the long-run operations and maintenance of the asset. And generally, you see P3s on a variety of different transportation assets. We hear a lot about toll road P3s, where it might be a little bit more intuitive why a P3 would make sense with a revenue-generating asset where you have tolls being paid and covering the costs of the asset. For transit, they have similar reasons, but these reasons are very much based on the efficiencies of bringing in the private sector, of, again, as I said, the risk transfer of certain risks that the private sector just can handle and manage more effectively than the public sector. This idea of planning for the whole life cycle of the project. You'll see with the projects that are being discussed, there is this thorough consideration of what are the decisions being made up front with the design and the construction of the project that will result in potential cost savings over the lifetime of the project? What kinds of investments now would make sense for long-run like rehab and reconstruction of the asset that we might not be able to consider solely if it was a public sector project. And this enhanced opportunity for innovation, this opportunity for the private sector to have an early say in the design and the construction, with keeping in mind that the innovation will result in potential savings over the life of the project. So it's this opportunity for the private sector to really get a chance to have their say early on what could be ways that we might deliver this more efficiently. And a lot of these combined, when you do a value for money analysis, you'll hear that that's often something that public sector agencies will do to determine whether or not they'll do a P3 or not, will result in long-term financial savings that you're investing now, potential to create potential savings in the future, and that all of that works together so that the project just makes better sense from a financial perspective. And then also, I'll talk about it in a bit, the availability payment structure, which is typically how you deliver a P3 and how you pay for a P3 over time, means that you have a more predictable payment stream over time, so that you know that in year 15 of the contract that you're supposed to pay the private sector concessionaire a certain amount, and that amount, if that's the amount you're going to be paying as the agency, and if the concessionaire somehow has problems and is not able to, has cost overruns in that particular year, it doesn't fall on you. That risk is not yours as the agency, it's the private sector's risks. They're supposed to predict what they're supposed to be spending over time, and that you're only bound to pay what they have predicted early on. So there's a traditional structure of constructing an asset that we're all probably familiar with. You have the public owner, and then you have these different contracts with the designer, the builder, and then potentially whoever would, if it wasn't the public owner, who would ever operate and maintain over time. So it's very individual relationships. There's very little connection. There's possibly loss of efficiencies because all of those decisions are spread out between different parties. And the public owner would either pay pay-go for the project, or, in more cases than not, some sort of public debt would be involved. In a concession structure, this is a very simple picture of what a concession structure would look like for a P3, is that the public owner's relationship, the agency, would be directly with the concessionaire, the private entity, that would be responsible for pulling together the team. It would be the team of both the design, build, contractor, and then the long-run operations and maintenance entity. And then they would also be responsible in bringing a certain amount of financing, both through debt. In the United States, that debt, it can sometimes come in the form of private activity bonds or TIFIA, so that you have rates that are lower and very comparable to public sector rates. And then also a certain amount of equity, which represents, for the private sector, the skin in the game, sort of a sort of personal stake in how the asset performs over time. And this equity is very important for those who would be lending to the project as well, just so that to ensure that there is really a commitment to ensuring that this project is both successful in the near term and the long term. This is just a structure that shows how that basic concessionaire structure, one example of how the revenue comes in and funds that structure. This is a typical revenue risk structure. So you see at the bottom a red box. This is what you might see more typically with a toll road, where the concessionaire is collecting the revenue directly and covering the costs in that way. It's a structure that certain, even toll road agencies or other types of P3s are kind of moving away from in some ways, and they're moving more towards this availability payment structure, which is much more common, if not sort of the exclusive way of financing the transit projects, because instead of the concessionaire taking the risk of the revenue of how much is flowing into the project in any given year, the revenue would be coming directly into the private sector, and then that payment to the concessionaire would be made from the public sector, so that you're taking away from the revenue risk, because as we know, transit doesn't cover the costs most of the time, in all cases, of the construction or the operation and maintenance, so that revenue risk complicates and creates much more difficult and costly way of delivering a P3, but it also, for this availability payment structure, it creates a mechanism through which the public sector can control and deduct for lack of performance from the private sector. So it very much lies at the heart of how a P3 for transit would operate over time. And these are just basic descriptors about what an availability payment structure involves. As I said, it's performance payment. So you determine at the beginning at the beginning of the contract, what the private sector will get paid over a period of time every year, based on certain performance targets and what they determine as their costs. And then if they don't meet those performance targets in any given year, you can deduct against the availability payments, really controlling for performance over time and really being able to, again, have a predictable outflow of payments associated with the project, which is great for long-term budgeting, because you know that for the next 30, 40 years, this is how much this asset's going to cost you. And if there are any problems, it will just cost you less, and you're able to control for hopefully any problems that would arise with operations of the asset. Also part of the structure, most of the time, you have payments during construction, either progress payments or milestone payments to the concessionaire throughout the construction of the asset, that are separate from the availability payments, but also create control over how quickly and how efficiently the project is delivered. As I said, the availability payments are based on performance measures. There's a whole host of performance measures that will end up in a P3 contract. Again, the two projects that will be discussed in a bit have a whole set pages of performance measures that will that control the relationship between the public and the private sector over the period of time. But it's controlling for things that are outcomes of the asset, their service levels, they're things that you're trying to achieve, the mobility kinds of things that we want to achieve with an asset, so that the private sector can figure out how to do it any way that they can and most efficiently can. But at the end of the day, you want the trains to show up on time, they want to be a certain level of cleanliness, you want the stations to be maintained, you want the relationship with the surrounding communities maintained at the level that had been promised at the beginning of the contract. The outcomes of the asset are really the focus of the performance measures. And in general, we know that P3s, while they are very beneficial for a variety of different types of projects, they are not necessarily the best option for every project. And that it's very important to determine the potential for a project in a very careful way before embarking on the project. Otherwise, the level of effort and the level of investment up front that's required to structure a well-developed P3 will be very costly and would be wasteful if it was not necessarily for the right types of projects. So this is the type of process that Maryland has been going through for the past 1.5 to 2 years for the Purple Line of determining the P3 potential for a transit asset. And this can be applied to various types of transportation assets, roads and port facilities and airport facilities. But this was very much a very important process, and that we're nearing the end of for the Purple Line, where you're looking at case studies, and we've looked at the case studies that will be discussed today as to determine what are the similarities between our project, our proposed project, and the projects that have been completed and have been successful in the past, determining the actual potential value, financial value of a P3 through either a value for money analysis, where you're comparing the value, the cost of delivering as the public sector versus the value that could be obtained by delivering through a P3 method. We developed that, and that was a very positive outcome from that analysis. There are other types of analysis out there, but that's very much the one that many agencies have been using recently. Doing a lot of industry outreach. It's very important to reach out to the market long before you do a P3, to reach out to the potential concessionaires, the potential team members that would be interested in the project to determine their true level of interest, because some of the real value from a P3 comes through the competition between the different concessionaires who come and bring their various ideas and are engaged in many months of an RFP process. You want to have enough players at the table so you're getting a true value of that competition. So that's both through an industry forum, where you get everyone together and you have discussions about what makes for a good P3 in this particular context. Request for information, so more of a written response type of analysis, type of effort, where you can see how many and what types of firms are really responding. And then also participation in industry events is very valuable, going to the conferences similar to these, but for the P3 industry, where you're talking to people, you're learning about projects, you're talking to the industry about what types of things they find to be interesting or successful, so that, or otherwise not successful, so you can tailor your P3 around what's really successful in the marketplace at the current time. And then starting to think about, this will evolve through the process of developing a P3, but at least a preliminary analysis of how you're going to balance the risks between the different parties, whether or not the public sector wants to retain a certain level of responsibility for security or for fare collection. Most likely fare policy is one that is almost always retained by the public sector, but starting to think about how that balances, so that when you do come to the table with the private sector, you know what are risks that you are willing to retain and what are risks that you're willing to potentially give to the private sector or share. I mean, there are many shared risks in a public-private partnership. And then really determining whether or not you do a project is one decision, and determining whether or not you deliver it as a P3 is an entirely different decision. But the people who make those two decisions and think about those things need to come together and actually figure out if the interests are aligned and the goals of the project and the P3 delivery are aligned enough such that delivery of the project as a P3 actually makes sense for all the people who are going to be involved in the design and the construction and the long run monitoring of the project. So thorough workshops and discussion about how these projects make sense or don't make sense as a P3 internally, both within an agency and with consultants who have been brought on to help deliver the project. Very important. We found extremely important with the Purple Line, just having those conversations about whether, how do we make it so that the project is delivered most effectively, and really have a thorough evaluation of whether or not you have the internal capacity as an agency to deliver a P3. You most likely will have to bring on quite a number of consultants who are specialists in delivery of some of these assets in this way, because it's a very different way of delivering a project. It involves very transaction focused. It's focused on concepts that you don't necessarily come across when you're trying to deliver through a typical design bid build process. So for our example, and the others will speak to, I'm sure, their examples of the teams that they've had to build, you have to bring on outside legal experts who know how to develop these types of contracts so that it actually results in the risk transfer that you're trying to target, trying to bring in transaction advisors who know how to put together these types of deals with the private sector in a way that you're not typically going to be doing as the public sector, and other technical consultants to make sure it all pieces together in a way that's efficient and attractive to the private sector as structure, which is kind of a delicate balance. As I mentioned, the project that we're focusing on, and which we're excited to learn about the examples from other places so that we can build a strong P3, is the Purple Line light rail in Maryland, which is essentially linking the stations of the WMATA system across the northern part of the DC area, and also connecting in with our MARC commuter rail in a way that it very much creates, fills a gap of mobility sort of across the region in a way that it's been more typically in a radial pattern. And for us, we've been through the process of determining whether or not we do it as a P3, and that decision has been made, and that we're very much starting the somewhat lengthy process of the procurement, which it's in the P3 context is termed for Maryland is the solicitation process, which really is an involved process. You have to be very certain that you want to move forward with a P3 to really start this multi-stage process of a request for qualifications, draft a request for proposals, and very sort of long interactive process with the private sector concessionaire teams that are interested in this project. So this is what we're embarking on literally right now with the Purple Line, and we are again looking to some of the other cases from projects across North America, both in the transit space and elsewhere, but we're lucky to have two great examples, which will be discussed right now. Let me just introduce the panelists for this discussion. We have first John Haythorne will be speaking. John is both the Vancouver and national team leader of Dentons P3 team. He practices in the areas of construction, engineering, and infrastructure, with special emphasis on negotiating, drafting, and advising on contracts. It's very much a big part of the P3 development process. He's particularly experienced in P3s, advising owners on the structure and administration of procurement and legal issues relating to design and construction, advising developers and contractors as proponents on P3 procurements. His role, and the one that we'll be discussing shortly, acted as counsel to the owners on the Canada Line, rapid transit project, which was approximately $2 billion, which entered service in 2009. And he's particularly well suited to discuss this because in addition to having a legal background, he has an engineering background, so he brings both perspectives to both his projects and I expect to this discussion. Following John, Bill Van Meter will be discussing his work with RTD. Mr. Van Meter has been employed at the Regional Transportation District in Colorado since 1991 and was appointed to his current position as Assistant General Manager of Planning in 2008. He has over 20 years of experience in the transportation planning field and has played a lead role in navigating the successful FTA full funding grant agreement for RTD's Eagle P3 project, which we'll be discussing shortly. Prior to his employment with RTD, Bill was employed as a transportation planner with the South Central Regional Council of Governments in Connecticut and holds a bachelor's and master's degree in economic geography from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. So thank you for listening to the 101, and we'll start with John discussing the Canada line.
Just one moment, I'll see if I can successfully navigate here. Should work. Okay, well, that's the right one. Yeah, thank you very much. I'm John Haythorne, and just by quick introduction, my law firm is Dentons. It's a new player on the block. Just quickly, previously we're a national Canadian firm called Fraser Milner Casgrain. We're 500 lawyers across Canada, but in March we joined with 3 other partnerships globally, one in the United States, one in the UK, and European. So we now are 2,500 lawyers nationally, and our profile is growing. And in this space, P3, I've been delighted to find when I went to our new partnership meeting in Orlando to meet guys who do what I do from London, and they've done all of the transit, or they've done highways, and so they've got deep experience, and fellows in Europe who are acting for Bouygues in the private sector, very deep experience in P3s. And so that's that. I feel like I should tell a joke or something. I don't know. I wish I could, But as a lawyer, I used to get. I was president of the Engineers Association. So I always get introduced to the lawyer's joke, and I became quite interested in that because the lawyer jokes are just nasty, aren't they? Like what's black and brown looks good on a lawyer? A Doberman, I don't know why that's funny. So I started collecting. So I said, no, I'm not going to fight back, and I started collecting engineering jokes. There's not very many engineering jokes. Like why does the engineer stare at the orange juice container in the morning? Because it says concentrate. So there are, and so I'm waiting for a P3 joke, because my theory is that jokes kind of tell what society thinks, because they're frustrated with law, it scares them, so they tell bad jokes. Engineers, they respect, they're tidy, they're predictable, but they're really kind of boring, so, right? Now, we need to wait for a P3 joke to how people really think of them. But anyway, I've been doing P3 since the very beginning. Just quickly, in Canada, it didn't really get going until our local government in BC took the lead in Canada, in British Columbia. They passed basically a law. The new Liberal government came in and they said you can't have tax dollars for infrastructure projects unless you prove the private sector can't do it. And they forced projects into a P3 model is what they did. They created partnerships, BC ultimately, and that really got a bit of deal flow going, and we see the rest of it across Canada. And the model we picked, the Europeans came, the Australians came, and on the project I'll speak about, we used Clifford Chance out of London as our consultants. I'm legal counsel, but we had legal counsel out of Europe, and so we adopted and tried to adopt an international model of how these things have come together. And I think there is an international model that's developed. It's procured very similarly, structured very similarly. And I was saying to Jodie, I really enjoyed her slides because they're an accurate prediction, summary, I think, of how these things, how P3s are done. Before I go into Canada a little bit more, I'll just confess a little bit more. I was a streets engineer, a municipal engineer before I did law. So I came from kind of that, and I'm very interested in a lot of the topics. You can tell I got a bit of a cold, so I couldn't get around to see all the things. There's many interesting topics. But I was kind of the liaison. I mean, I did between engineering and planning in City Hall in the City of Vancouver. And a lot of these ideas I really, really enjoyed about why you do and how you do public infrastructure. But one of the things that I hit on as a young kid was there is an awful lot of infrastructure that's needed. Like, never mind the new stuff, but the old stuff. We're replacing wooden pipes, culverts for water mains back, and they're still replacing them. I mean, there's a lot to do. So incremental value, incremental savings in costs is enormous for us all in infrastructure. And I believe that's the main reason why you do P3s. It's not as if you always get a real home run ball, but if you can do it a little bit better, it's worth it. And the way you do it is because fundamentally, if you look at traditional procurement, I'm sorry, but I've been through it a million times. I've acted for a million governments since, all levels, federal, all levels. Design, bid, build, as Jodie's slide showed, the three ones, you had a great slide there. It essentially isolates the major steps of a project. The designer often has no idea about operating, none. Doesn't even think about it. They got a professional duty to build something safe. So they make the culvert this big, but this big would be better. So we just waste a whole bunch of money and bury it and say, isn't it wonderful because it never flooded? No, you just spent twice the money you had to. That's a big, 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 big problem in North America and the Western world. We got to stop overbuilding stuff. How do you do it? You make the designers have skin in the game to make it operate cost effectively. That's what you do. And how do you make it cost effective? Competition. Jodie's absolutely right. You have to run a procurement with keen. I can't repeat it enough. Competition. That's the way you squeeze the benefit out of it. So if you do a P3 structure without competition, save your money. Just build it fast and get over with it, in my view. Don't do it. It's not worth it. They're hard and they're expensive. You pay lawyers a whole bunch of money. But if you get competition, and I'll tell you about our project, you can get wonderful, wonderful results and great infrastructure. That's my impassioned speech. Now I'll get back to business. I'm going to finish on time, Bill. You kicked me off here. So here, what do I got to do here now? Okay, so the project I'm talking about is Canada Line. I was very lucky. I started right at the beginning. Jane Bird maybe you've heard of her, but she was a CEO and a very, very talented person. I got to start work here right from the beginning. This is one of the two bridges of our project going across the Fraser River just before the airport. And so, here's you can't really see this, but this is quite a lovely picture showing the congestion as it was being built down Cambie Street towards the downtown core. And the way the project was built, it was tunneled through the undercore, and then it was cut and covered. I'll tell you about that in a sec. Through a lot of the rest of the way, and then it goes elevated out when you come out to the river and the flats. Okay, and I'll just say here's quickly. It's 19.5 kilometers, connects the downtown core, the waterfront, through the airport with a twin off to the city of Richmond. It goes through the city of Vancouver. I don't know how many people are. I should have said one thing, by the way. These are my own views. Not Canada Lines or not TransLinks or somebody else. My own views. What we did is we used the city corridor, so it runs under the city streets, took care of all the land issues, but it meant that we had to do deals with the city of Vancouver and the city of Richmond, and we had to get not only their political buy-in, but we had to have their legal buy-in because we had to have access agreements with them, and so we had all that unbelievable complexity to pull the project together. Multi-levels of government to make it work. 4 levels of funding in the end, and then these various local political agreements. 16 stations, 2 bridges, 9 kilometers of tunnel. It's a 35-year design, build, finance, operate, maintain concession, about $2 billion. It was, I'll give a little bit more, but it's been in operation and it's exceeded all projections. The ridership guys are so conservative. And we've blown that way past that, and people are now talking about it being too successful. And they're actually trying to there's a controversy over more development along its length because it's becoming too congested, if you can imagine. Right? It's just too successful stops or notion. Okay, funding. It was funded about $1.3 billion, basically in a milestone regime by senior levels of government, with the rest being put in by the concessionaire and debt and equity. And so lots of discussion about how to gear that and what to do that. And frankly, there's another level of discussion, but it's nothing for free. And this is expensive money. So you just want enough money here so these guys pay attention. You want enough, they say that, to get an effective risk transfer, we have all kinds of terms for it, but basically, and it's even more nuanced than that. Lenders aren't going to give money if they're not going to get it back, so banks get their money back. So actually, the gearing is the equity at risk, where if the sky falls in, the equity guys don't get paid back, and that's where all the pressure really is on making sure everybody does what they're saying, right? And in support of what Jodie said, we did it with ours. You have a payment regime which is simple enough to administer. We say that, simple enough. We had UK examples where they had payment clauses like this. Nobody ever read them. You couldn't read them. I remember one of their tests I read is for Windows, you had to be able to read the telegram from 14 inches with the paper on the back side of the window. If you could read it, it was clean enough. Who in the hell is ever going to read that? Nobody. So a lot of the art of this, the reason I'm emphasizing that, the art of these deals is to make them work. You have to make them work. So you have to have payment clauses that are effective so as to get their attention, but not kill them. They got to maim, but not kill. They can't ignore you, but you can't kill them, right? Doesn't work that way. Because nobody can afford to have a project go into default. That's never going to happen. So you don't write default clauses, you write clauses which are very carefully selected as indicative of performance to make sure you get the services you bargained for. Okay, make sure I'm faster. Okay, won lots of awards. It was a big deal when it came through. Just put that up there for fun. Procurement strategy. We really focused on performance specs and tried to back away from over designing. And on this, with the way we're able to do this, in our negotiations with the cities, 2 cities I mentioned, we go through the city of Vancouver, the city of Richmond. City politicians would like to know what they're going to get. And we were able to negotiate a set of essential elements, which were core performance features. So we had the time of travel, we had the amount of disruption laterally, and key elements that we were able to embed into the procurement process to require that bidders meet and compete against, essentially getting the competition to better the project we were delivering to the municipalities. Do you follow what I mean? So we really lined that up very carefully, and we got some good results. Funding is always critical, and it was critical in our case. A very controversial point was that what happened, the amount of funding we had through our analysis was not going to be enough to give us tunneling as much as we want. We couldn't afford it. That was the accepted wisdom. We had experts come in from all around the world. And what the idea was that we would tunnel from the harbor under the downtown core and then start out through a residential area. And then when you run out of money, pop up to the surface and go the rest of the way. That was the strategy. What else do you do? And everybody said that nobody would take the geotechnical risk of tunneling, because that's nasty. If you know anything about projects, it's really nasty. But we procured it without dictating that. We procured it to say, we just want cars to travel from the downtown to the airport in 25 minutes, blah, blah, blah. We gave all the statistics. We made it simple. And we left that open. And the winners came up with an aha. And what they did is they did most of it by restricting the tunneling length, reducing that risk, and doing cut and cover. And they were able, in that way, to take all the risk. They took the risk off the owner. We didn't even ask for it. They took the risk, And then through this cut and cover process, we were able to save enough money so they gave us tunnel right through the area, the community, which was deadly against the project because of the disruption it was going to have, having a suspended, you can imagine, you're going to have a like this out here, a line right in front of your view. And so it was a real win for everybody through being, and I could give you story after story on that point. Anyway, we had these set of essential elements, completion date. We had the Olympics coming on, and funding limits. We had a limited amount of money. So we basically had an affordability ceiling, like, guys, don't waste your time. We put that early, said, don't waste your time. You got to get to this, you got to help us get to this. And that, in this case, worked. Now just really quickly, alignment. You always need permits. You go get an environmental permit. If you go to a regulator, they say, okay, I'll consider your permit. What's your project? So problem when you're doing a P3 is you say, we're not quite sure yet. They go, well, you come back and tell me when you have a project. So you go to the proponents, you say, okay, you guys know, blow your brains out, spend a couple $1 million, prepare a design, and they say, well, where's our permit? We say, well, we don't know yet. We're going to take your ideas and see if the regulator will agree. They'll go, you're out of your mind. We're not doing that, right? So there are real serious procurement issues of lining up various levels of government. We run into that with us. What we did was we were able to talk to the regulators and get them to agree to a corridor of where the project would go, but allow final design to follow, and so that we were able to kind of pass the baton on permitting from the owner to the preferred proponent, to the concessionaire, to finalize, so we could get optimization. And they could actually save money on the construction. Just as a quick example. Okay, here's what we did, just quickly, if you're interested. We started in 02. We did a request for expression of interest back then. We had 10 guys who showed up. We shortlisted to 4 in this case. Then we had always planned as a BAFO, so we had a 2-stage. We just thought it was too big at that time, we used Price Waterhouse out of London, England as our financial advisors. And so they had a heavy hand in that. So what we did is then, one team then withdrew, procurement risk. So we had 3. Then in January 04, we got 3 in. We evaluated those for the first step and then shortlisted to 2. And then we got a best and final offer in which we, for instance, sharpened up those key elements of the procurement, enabled them to get a final offer. Final one selected, financial close being in 05, and then a 4-year build. So, and now it's, I think most people would say it's a huge success. It's a private company that's operating it, and ridership growth exceeded projections. In this case, what we weren't allowed to sort of allow for really was the fact that there'd be two-way demand. So we got airport, we got ridership going from the Richmond as a bedroom community coming into Vancouver. We got a lot of people going from Vancouver out to the airport and out into Richmond. So all day long, it's we have demand in both directions, which is and also demand all along its length, which again is unusual for a project. It's an availability, basically availability. We have a 10% slice, which is kind of revenue driven. We wanted something in there to give them some incentive in terms of ridership, but mostly it's an availability payment deal. And we needed to do that because the TransLink, which is our local transit regulator, wanted to control fares, and so couldn't really go to any kind of market level, so it was logical to go with that. And it was interesting, your comment, Jodie, that I believe that's the direction too. The having revenue-based, toll-based stuff skews public policy in terms of how you manage that route's costs, and all kind of screwy things happen. And I think, I don't know, I'm not a financial guy, but my sense is that it wouldn't be that hard to find that smart money is to do availability and so you can maintain proper control of transportation policy. It's more your guys' area than mine, I'm sure. Okay, so I wanted, just in the context of this conference, one of the things we didn't do is in this project, we did not do detailed design of these stations. We have above grade stations and we have below grade stations. And I really should say my friend Edward LaFluffy who invited me to come and speak to you. Maybe some of you know him, but he's a designer of stations and a particular transit designer working out of Vancouver, and was in control of this for the owner's side. And we did specify functional requirements for each station, and through early public consultation, put stations into groups, sort of families of stations, so the Richmond ones and the airport ones, and so on. So we had ones which would have sort of constant themes, but after that, we left it alone, and we left the concessionaire to do that design, detailed design, under the concession agreement. Now, the concession agreement, though, required that design go through public consultation itself. So we built a requirement for them to get levels of buy-in, or levels at least of input from the public as they're refining the final designs, rather than us getting in the way at the beginning. And it's an example where we talk about where it's such a tension between the government side and a private side to know how far to go and when to back away and allow the competition to run. We have in Vancouver parallel lines, and I was just speaking to Edward, saying, sort of cross-examining a lawyer, honestly, Edward, is the quality, say, of Canada Line on a comparable station to the ones that were built as designed bid build, have it suffered? And he said no. In his view, they didn't. They didn't suffer. These guys have still got to build for 35 years, and they're certainly mindful of costs and so on, but they did not make it so that you feel like you're going into a mine shaft or a mining shed or something when you go into an underground station. Okay, I already talked about this too much. Probably I really want to say this too, that P3s they're so hard to have the public understand it, but it is a deliberate and deliberate sharing of responsibilities between the public and the private sector. Privatization, the government just gives it away. If you want to do it yourself, you keep it. But a P3 is this strategic decision on who takes what in terms of a whole life view, starting from the original notions through design and so on and into operation. And of course, this is the one that you hear over and over. It's funny, I was waiting to hear it today. When we first started doing all these conferences, we hear this over and over. That the mantra is that, at least as a principle, as between the government and the private sector, look at a given risk. Who is in a better position to reduce that risk? And that's an indication, at least an indication, of where you should park it. And then, of course, it's always a question of how much the private sector is going to charge you to take that risk. Like I hear way too much stuff in the public about saying, well, it's great, we gave them all the risk. I'm going, well, good for you. I'd hate to see the price of that, So it's a balance between who can better control it, but also what's the charge for it. And that's not a constant. As we watch the financial crisis come along and so on, the appetite for risk changes. So that's why P3s, let me just say this, P3s, it's great to have standardization and sort of have issues which are sort of cookie cutter, but in my view it doesn't really work, because you need to be sensitive to the uniqueness of your project and the combination of risks to really understand whether you're getting value for a risk transfer that you might be interested in. And that takes up quite a bit more thought and thinking. And let me just say this quickly. What we did in our project, and which I think is common in sort of the international model, is during procurement to have individual one-on-one confidential discussions with the bidders while this competition is excruciatingly intense. We're trying to do it, but we still have the conversations so as to be able to optimize the procurement. And I want to really emphasize that point, and I would emphasize it respectfully to some of you folks down here, because we do have U.S. consultants come up and talk to us and with us, but in Canada, but our procurement method is different. And it sometimes just takes a minute or two to kind of adjust. we have very strict rules in Canada about procurement, about the duties on owners to be fair, and so the competition is well defined in our documents. The big risk we have a notion of an invalid or a non-compliant bid. A proponent doesn't want to work away assiduously and come up with a great idea, which is simply a no-go, right? What has he done? He got nothing. And the owner loses too, right? The owner now loses the competition. So both parties have a huge interest in making sure a good, valid, competitive bid comes in. And for that reason, we open up these conversations so they can check to be sure that what they're giving is something that the owner could take. And it's a way of giving them a safety net so they can compete hard for the owner's benefit in a safe way. I just wanted to really emphasize that. And it's a real trick to do that in procurement. Okay, I'm going to quit now. Nothing if we already talked about that. I want to emphasize this point. No such thing as a good deal that is too good, right? If the proponent's going to lose, if the concessionaire is going to lose money, he's just going to go broke. Everybody loses. So that can't happen. You have to have something which is respectably profitable. So you're trying to find design optimizations and a good project which justify the cost of money and justify the necessary profit they must get. If they don't have profit, you got a bad deal. I would never sign a deal where the concessionaire is about to go broke. You can't do it. It'll just be a disaster. Okay, so I'm going to stop. I should say this, maybe some of you know Partnerships BC at this website. They put all the projects out there. I mean, I've been involved in many others, hospitals, highways, safety accommodations, and so on. And all this, Partnerships BC is a resource for you. It's got all their documentation there, so you can see RFPs and see documentation, and as well as reports on all the projects we've done in British Columbia. There's my disclaimer. Every good lawyer does that. There you go. Thank you very much. Let me just get you up the other one. Bill, I'll just load you up here.
Thank you, and while John's doing that, I will start with my attempt. It will fall flat, I'm sure, at a little joke following in the very same vein that John started his comments. And it's also an attempt to set up my discussion and presentation regarding the Eagle P3 project in Denver. And that joke comes from my general manager. It's a common one that came from someone else and is applicable in many different circumstances, but it is the one that if you've seen one P3, you have seen one P3. Having said that, there are a lot of similarities, a lot of common themes that you've heard both from Jodie and John. You're going to hear them again from me. I won't try to dwell on those, but I'll try to really give you a feel as to the story, kind of set the context a little bit for the Eagle P3 project in Denver, and give you a good feel as to where we are and some of our lessons learned as it relates to overall project delivery, and also our experiences with transit-oriented development integration into a massive P3. RTD is the primary public transit service operator in the Denver metro area, 2.8 million residents, 2,300 plus square miles of service. Over 50% of the population of the state of Colorado lives within our service district. In 2004, we went to the ballot with an initiative called Fast Tracks, asking the voters to approve a 0.4% sales tax increase to fund a pretty sizable expansion of our rapid transit system. 120-ish miles of new commuter rail and light rail, 18 miles of bus rapid transit, 31,000 parking spaces, redevelopment of Denver Union Station as the central hub for those rail lines and the bus rapid transit line. Voters approved it overwhelmingly, 58% positive, we embarked on implementation of this aggressive program with a lot of confidence. Confidence that we could complete the full program within a 12-year period. We've made a lot of progress. This slide is articulating the progress to date since 2004. We opened our first major project, the West Corridor, earlier this year, in the spring of this year, 12-mile light rail line. We have a lot of other projects in progress, including the Eagle P3. Procurement on line right now in process in response to an unsolicited proposal that we received that had technical merit, and that we think we have the financial capacity to complete another sizable portion of what was committed to the voters as part of that initiative in 2004. Next major milestone for us is the opening of Denver Union Station, 22 bus bays, in the spring of next year. I believe that opening date's May 9th, if any of you are planning, junkies who love to come look at openings. Positive story, making a lot of progress, a lot of impetus, a lot of excitement in the region regarding this massive expansion. The downside of the story, the perfect storm, the economic recession of the late 2000s, coupled directly in front of that was some rapid price escalation for materials and construction, certainly nationwide and in the Denver region. Skyrocketing costs, plummeting revenues, incapability to deliver the full program within 12 years. A real tough dialogue, then RTD saw an opportunity. And that opportunity came through the Federal Transit Administration's promulgation of the Penta-P program, Penta-P, Public-Private Partnership Pilot Program. We were one of 3 agencies accepted into the Penta-P, Public-Private Partnership Pilot Program, by FTA, right at about the same time as we were really understanding the financial straits that we were in, that we did not have the wherewithal to complete everything that we had committed. And we saw this as an opportunity. FTA was really looking at how to do the risk transfer piece, how to save time, how to save money on project delivery, and really looking at international examples of P3s and national examples in other infrastructure development spaces, and saying, let's do a pilot program, provide some incentives in terms of streamlining the FFGA, the New Starts funding process for people who are in that program, and some other carrots to see whether we can prove the concept for a P3. We applied for and were accepted into that program. FTA's intent was to prove the concept in the U.S. We're the only agency that actually made it through that process and got to a close, a selection of concessionaire close, and we are now in the process of constructing our Eagle P3 project. Our board approved the selection of Denver Transit projects in June of 2010. 3 years from entry into that Penta-P program, through the New Starts process and the concurrent procurement process. So funding process and procurement process is a whole different story. The challenges of trying to pursue an FFGA while keeping concessionaires, investors, and others on board in a concession team and preparing a bid. I won't go down that path. The Eagle P3 project, just real quickly, it's 3 commuter rail lines, 2 complete ones, 22 miles east rail line from downtown Denver, Denver Union Station, to the DIA, Denver International Airport. About a 12-mile line, 12-mile line on the Gold Line north from Denver Union Station, and then west through our suburban communities of Arvada and Wheat Ridge, and then a short extension off of that line, starting our northwest rail corridor that will eventually extend to Boulder and Longmont, and the first portion of that all encapsulated in this one P3 project, about 36 miles of new commuter rail electric multiple unit in the metro area. $2.2 billion capital budget and a $1.03 billion full funding grant agreement committed by FTA at the end of the day to help us finance and fund this project. I've heard a lot about risk sharing. Here's our risk sharing matrix. During the development of the RFP, we consulted in private consultation with the competing teams and asked for their input. We proposed risk structures. They pushed back and they said, we don't want to take this risk. And we said, why? And we really worked through who was the appropriate party to share the risks and responsibility. Bottom line, risks that really couldn't be managed well by a constructor operator. I'm not going to read them all. Relax, don't worry. Were retained by RTD. Those that were best managed by the private sector, we put on the private sector, and we had some shared risks as well. This was a key piece in development of our concession agreement during the RFP preparation process as we were developing the RFP. So the Eagle P3 project is really the first transit P3 of this magnitude in the U.S. You've heard some of this before. RTD retains ownership of all the assets. Our board of directors retains control over fare policy for the system. As a result, we were not able to transfer ridership risk to the private sector. We retained that risk on the public sector side, both revenue and ridership risk. It's a 34-year contract, 5-6-year design build. We had 30% designs. They're taking it the rest of the way. And then 28, 29 years of operation. Penalties and incentives built into the contract. If the concessionaire team delivers in a year, perfect delivery as defined in not a deep, thick set of performance measures, but a thin one, perfect delivery, they get an incentive of 0.5% bonus. There's an incentive there. Worst case, poor delivery, well, very worst case, there's step-in rights and we can terminate the contract for non-performance. But there are a number, and worst case could be a 25% deduct on the service availability portion of the contract for station availability, service, cleanliness, all the various standards that Jodie and John have discussed, if those standards as defined in the contract are not met. So there's strong reason for the private sector to deliver on what they've committed to. A little bit more on the financial structure. I mentioned the $1 billion full funding grant agreement, which was received in 2011. A good year after we had awarded the concession agreement. That's the different story we can go into. If you have questions, I can address that later. $280 million Transportation, Infrastructure, Finance, and Innovation Act, TIFIA, loan, also awarded later that same year in 2011 to help fund it. $398 million in direct private activity bonds as well as concessionaire direct financing. The skin in the game. And about $500 million in local RTD and local government funds to close the rest of that gap. Our competitive procurement compared to our internal cost estimates showed a savings of about $305 million actually compared to our internal cost estimates for the capital portion and delivery of this project. It is an availability payment structure, as Jodie and John have both discussed. Switching gears for a moment. Our approach to transit-oriented development and real estate as we developed the RFP. I was very motivated. Our transit-oriented development staff were very motivated to try to incorporate kind of a proactive opportunity for the concessionaires to make proposals on TOD. as part of the RFP process. It did not pan out at the end, and we did not require TOD projects to be in projects or components to be incorporated in the RFP process because it's messy. We consulted with experts. We talked in-house. These concessionaires are geared towards designing, building, operating, maintaining, and financing a transit project, not toward the messy real estate deals that can often take time, have a lot of local jurisdiction involvement. We wanted them focused on delivery of the main project, the core project. But up front, we spent a lot of time in management and in discussions with stakeholders and others trying to figure out how we could achieve that, how we could incorporate transit-oriented development goals as potential project enhancements, as well as financial and enhancements for the project. Did not work out during the RFP process. We didn't preclude it, but we didn't specifically require TOD plans to be incorporated during the RFP process. Regardless, we have had some success, and I'll try to finish on some of the successful projects that are happening as we're constructing the project at a couple of the stations, really incorporating TOD, where we've had to be flexible, local jurisdictions, and the concessionaire. We're 50% done with construction. Our PI people gave me some pictures of construction to put in, so there you go. There's some progress of the project, some more cool construction projects. If you're in Denver, you can see that it's changing on a daily, almost daily basis. We're 50% of the way to a 2016 opening of the Eagle project. And although we did not proactively incorporate requirements for TOD in the RFP, we've had some successes subsequently. In particular, Old Town Arvada on the Gold Line and the Westminster Station on the northwest segment that will eventually extend to Boulder and Longmont. We worked with local jurisdictions at those two stations. One of them is in our transit-oriented development pilot program, but both of them incorporated a sizable amount of parking and bus transfer facilities. In terms of cost and delivery of the project, RTD planned surface parking and a surface bus facility. The opportunity is being realized at these two stations to build structured parking, utilize the excess land. As a result, shared parking is a possibility in order to realize a real mixed-use transit-oriented development at both of these stations. But in order to accomplish that, RTD had to do a deductive change order. We had to take those surface park and rides and bus transfer facilities out of the concessionaire's contract and use those monies to help fund the grander transit-oriented development vision at those stations. We did not get full value back. A deductive change order did not give us a dollar-for-dollar return on that investment. Westminster Station is one of those TODs. They've just put out and are in the process of having developers respond to their request for proposals for parking and a bus facility at their station on the Westminster line. We will be contributing those proceeds from the deductive change order towards the overall development of the transit-oriented development at that station. Similarly, at the Old Town Arvada station, TOD, we have selected in concert with the city and the Urban Renewal Authority a preferred developer at that location, similar requirements and structure for mixed-use transit-oriented development, taking advantage of the parking the land freed up by going to structured parking to realize something greater, and RTD contributing our land and the dollars saved through the deductive change order to that process. We have a number of lessons learned. You've heard a lot of them from our previous speakers. Solid financial consultant early on for our P3 procurement. Experienced legal team who's been through this before to give you good advice. We had an internal management steering committee that met every week for a couple of hours to try to make key decisions and make recommendations to our board of directors. We released an RFQ, shortlisted qualified teams. We had stipends for the losing team. We were open and transparent throughout the process to the extent we could be in a competitive process, RFP process, but really met often with our board of directors to help them understand what this whole new procurement process was about, and really worked on educating the public and making sure that we had solid support behind us. We set a schedule, we worked through our issues, timing on funding. We held our own team members to deadlines. Our current general manager served his career in the military, so he ordered military silence on those parts of the procurement that needed to remain quiet, and we had a very successful approach from that process. Developed a lot of spent a lot of time working with the bidding teams in private conversations to inform the development of our RFP and make sure that we would get a competitive bid from them that also met our requirements. Alternative technical concepts, an approach to finding value in different construction methods, means, and project requirements. That was some lessons learned on the project procurement and delivery side. On P3s and TOD, identify your TOD opportunities that are ripe and pull them out of the scope. Gee, if we could have done that, if we'd known we were going to be entering into these TOD agreements at Old Town in Arvada and the Westminster Station, we would not have included those elements in the concession contract, and we would have had more flexibility and more money to help the local governments fund the vision that they have for transit-oriented development. We're moving forward, we're past that, we've got some successful partnerships. If we and the local governments had been further ahead, we could have avoided some of that. If TOD opportunities materialize, as they have for us during the design-build phase, we've got to clearly establish a procedure to remove that station and park and ride from the concessionaire scope. That was a difficult process for us, pricing it and doing that deductive change order. If the local jurisdictions or developers are responsible for funding some of the elements associated with the TOD that benefit and are required for the transit operations on opening day, make sure that you have the ability to step back in and deliver the basic parking and bus transfer and other station amenities that are required for your operations. We've done that. And have a backup plan if all else fails. So that's my attempt to give you a real brief high-level overview of the Eagle P3 project, and maybe pique your interest a little bit as to what we're doing with TOD and where we are and how we've gotten to that point. Clean close up. So last night, one more attempt at a joke. Last night I was dining at Pike Place. They have pigs everywhere. Have you seen those pigs? It's an art theme and a way to collect money. And so I had this brainstorm after a couple of drinks that I could try this out. Another alternative P3 is the Pike Place pig. Thank you.
The bot, this isn't even on yet. We can take questions. I think for the filming they need it on the microphone, but take questions from the audience, and we can repeat them if the microphone doesn't work. Right here.
Yeah, I'm curious.
See if we can try
Oh,
this.
I can try.
Do we need it for the filming? Yeah. Okay.
No, we're filming too. Oh, this is great. So I have a question for transit agencies who are more than just the owner. They are also revenue, collect revenue and operate and maintain the facilities. Will P3, is there a structure that would work for that kind of scenario?
Well, I'll take a first attempt. RTD designs, builds, operates, and maintains service. In this case, one of the things that we did have to deal with was making sure that we were in compliance with our union agreements. And our union agreements clearly spell out that we, RTD, would need or have the responsibility of operating both bus and light rail service. So one of the fortuitous circumstances is that these projects and lines are commuter rail, a different mode of service that's not covered under our current collective bargaining agreement with the union. That gave us the opportunity to outsource or privatize those operations for the Eagle P3.
Is there anybody from here from TransLink, by the way? I saw there's some guests here. In our region it's TransLink, and TransLink has the authority to look after transit in the region, and TransLink is the owner effectively of our Canada line. But when you say you're responsible for own and operate and maintain, that of course is taken away with respect to the particular, the facility that you're talking about, because you give a concession. One way of looking at this I think is helpful is to see P3s not as not in sort of traditional terms at all, but it's an owner's asset that you've hired somebody to run and manage for 25 years. You own it, but they have full responsibility for it. And the trick to think about it is that the monthly payment is a unified payment against getting the day-over-day service that you've bargained for. So operating, maintaining, all those are rolled into that concession payment. And so, yes, it can fit within a regime, but to Bill's point, you certainly have to take care of labor and other issues to make it fit. But in my view, they certainly can fit. In our case, they do.
Is it working? No, it's not.
Yeah, it works.
Is it working?
Yeah.
I guess the first question is for Jodie. If we tied your hands behind your back, could you still talk? My question is about availability payments. I'd like to hear what the source of the availability payments were on those two projects. And we're considering some projects where there's a huge amount of TOD activity happening along a corridor, and we're looking at tax increment financing and assessment district revenues as the source, potential source of the availability payment. And of course, there's less assurance. So we think we need to have a backstop involved in that project. But I'd like to know what your sources of availability payment, how strong they are, does the city have to stand behind it, some of the details.
Do you want to?
Well, I'll be really fast. In our case, from a P3 point of view, you're entering into a contract with a concessionaire, and they are taking a view. They're saying, Fred, I don't care where you get the money, you're going to make a monthly payment. And so, to be honest, in terms of the credit worthiness of governments, these sophisticated contractors are taking a view, and there will be some P3s that they won't enter into for that risk. But from a strictly contractual point of view, the government side has to find money wherever it wants, and it's not part of the deal in other sources of funds in an availability case. Availability says if the road's open or the trains run, government owns, period.
The question is, what was your source? Just general fund?
Yes, general funds. In our case, we had all the ridership studies when we had levels of government funding, so essentially grants. so that we knew, there's one thing that wasn't made clear, maybe you're aware of this, but when we do these projects, there's a full financial model. And the concession is a financial model the owner side builds. That's why you're going to hire your financial consultant. And the concessionaire will deliver its financial model, which has everything detailed, including reserves for capital upgrades, and all that stuff is all built right in there, so everybody can see all the source of funds exactly to the penny, whether it's required over the term. And that allows the government side then to do its planning and see where it needs to do to plan its budgeting. Bill, you probably know more about that.
Yeah, so the short answer and simple answer is sales tax revenues from the original sales tax increase, funding fast tracks, 0.4%, fare box revenues, and whatever other advertising and other revenues the agency has. So the same revenue stream that supports the operation of the rest of RTD. The slightly more complicated answer is the availability payment was broken into two pieces for RTD. One is the capital, essentially the capital repayment piece, and the concessionaire wanted us to secure that and backstop it essentially with some of our taxpayer Bill of Rights, TABOR, authorized capacity, one of the restrictions we operate in Colorado. So there were some additional protections that the private sector wanted us to put in, and as we did our analyses with our financial advisors, we ascertained that that was going to be to our benefit, making that sort of commitment. Otherwise, the cost of the private sector contributions and investments would have skyrocketed. There's also then a service portion, so the capital portion of the availability payment, service portion of the availability payment, which is supported as well by the revenues I described previously. Yeah.
I'm Don Williams with the Metropolitan Atlanta Rapid Transit Authority, and one of the things we're looking to do is to issue an RFP for P3. And the question I have is, in terms of the sequence of events and activities that you will have in place prior to doing that, could you kind of talk about that? The issues I'm concerned about is having the internal structure as well as the financial capacity to actually implement a P3 project. So I want to know, from a sequence of activities, what are some of the most important things you have to have in place prior to issuing an RFP?
Well, I'll take a first stab from our perspective, at least what our experience was. We had advanced to a place where we had almost all of our environmental clearances done. We had a 30% engineering work done, and we then entered that Penta-P program at that point. We hired our financial consultants and our legal consultants before embarking on the RFQ phase, even before doing that. They informed us from the very start and were giving us advice as to how to construct the RFQ and advice on stipends and other things all the way through. We stopped design at the 30% level. We didn't want to be overly prescriptive on the design elements, and we wanted to give the design build teams opportunities to deviate. We committed to working with them to make environmental clearances along the way as we went through the process. Concurrently, we were working on getting the funding in place. We had enough to make a project that was attractive to the private sector. So if we didn't realize full funding, we would have proceeded with just one of the corridors, but we had enough in place that that one corridor was enticing enough to keep the concession teams in competition while we worked on getting the financing for the full project in a concurrent basis. That was our experience. I'm not sure that was the best way to do it. It worked out at the end.
I'll be really fast. I think from my experience, there's initially, long in advance, needs to be a business case developed. And so you do have to have the financial structure understanding, and you need original, first cut cost estimates of your project, and a good understanding of how it will be financed and what the structure is in place. And in my experience, you need to do that really quite early because the market is highly sensitive to, and you have to remember the people you're going to be dealing with, they've done through 20 of them. So they'll know right away if you don't know what you're doing and you got ahead of yourself. So long before you go to an RFQ, you're going to have that in place and have your kind of governance structure there. The other thing they'll be very sensitive to is if you don't have decision makers there who actually have the authority to move forward, again, you won't get the interest you're looking for. People are very sensitive to that. So there's some real, standard sort of preliminary work you need to do long before you ever think of talking to the market.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question. So in the back.
Hi, I've been on the Canada line. The 3-minute headways are really impressive. But I noticed that the platforms are really short. Looked like on subway stations they could handle maybe 2 or 3 car trains. And I was just wondering if that was a compromise that you had to make because of the P3 format, and if you could just speak to that.
Sure, I can. In terms of the length, that's a classic one. Their design is there to allow for it to go bigger if we need to. I was asking my friend Edward about that the other day, and he was pointing out that 3 minutes, there's lots of room to decrease the headways and increase the capacity. It just means to go buy some more cars. Under that structure, the cars are owned by the concessionaire. So it would be a change to these contracts to bring in more cars, and you'd have to have a new funding agreement to make that adjustment. But to me, as an engineer, it's a real classic example of, yes, it'd be nice to build big, huge stations going in, which is why you never get projects built in the first place, because the design that comes forward is mandated to say we must have a station this big. Whereas we said we want a certain amount of volume of people moving at a certain period. You guys decide. And so this is what showed up. And with all respect to even 30% design, I think that's going a long way. If you really do stick to performance and see and have a real fixed idea on what you can afford now and what you can afford over time. We have huge development pressure coming on that project. I have no doubt at all that there will be both increase in some reconstruction to stations, but also more cars.
Well, thank you. I think we're about at the time now. I want to thank Bill and John for sharing their experience about P3s, and hopefully we'll see more, including the Purple Line and future projects and public-private partnerships coming in transit, so we can see how they develop in the future. Thank you for joining this afternoon.